This is Saxophone Talk by Eastman, a show that features many of the prominent saxophonists in the musical scene, with an opportunity to hear their stories, experiences, and challenges that occurred throughout their musical careers. I'm Roger Greenberg, saxophone specialist for Eastman. Today, the tables are turned. We have Harvey Pittel interviewing me. We hope you enjoy.
I'm Harvey Pittel, classical saxophonist and Andreas Eastman artist. I have the privilege today of interviewing Roger Greenberg, who I've known since we met in the West Point Military Academy Band in 1966. Throughout these many chapters in our lives, I've constantly been impressed by Roger's knowledge and performance of a wide range of musical genres and styles, in addition to the magic he brings to music making. Roger, you've played jazz, commercial music, performed as an on-call saxophonist with symphony orchestras, appeared as soloist with orchestra and wind bands, and you've been a chamber musician, to include many years on the road with our Harvey Pittel Saxophone Quartet. You've had a distinguished career as a college professor as well at the University of Northern Colorado, and previously as a woodwind and saxophone teacher in Los Angeles at USC, Long Beach State, Caltech, and many others. In addition to all that, you've developed quality saxophones and brought them to the marketplace. Roger, can you tell us about your early years of study on the saxophone and making music before you attended Juilliard? Where'd you grow up? Who were your first teachers? And what were your early influences?
First of all, thanks for having me here. I grew up I was actually born in Pottsville, Pennsylvania. I grew up early childhood in Reading, Pennsylvania. At the age of 7, I was listening to the radio and I heard someone playing saxophone, and I just looked over to my mom, who was in the kitchen at the time, and I said, I'd like to play saxophone. And the next day, she and my dad took me down to the local music store and bought me a curved soprano saxophone.
Wow.
That I started lessons with the next week at the music store. And the lessons were with a man named Samuel Correnti. Samuel Correnti was an ex-big band sideman who played for years on the road with big bands. And he was kind of retired, but teaching at this music store in Reading, Pennsylvania. And he was a great motivator. He made everything interesting. From the first lesson, every week he would write out a simple tune. At first it was maybe a nursery rhyme kind of tune. Uh-huh. And after that, as I started to get a little bit more advanced, he would start to write out very simple versions of some of the great American songbook. And he formed a group called the Saxophonists.
Amazing.
And he wrote arrangements for this group. Huh. And before we knew it, we were playing at all kinds of things like the veterans' homes, and we played in veterans' hospitals, played even in prisons around the area, and everybody loved it. With 8, 9, 10-year-old kids playing saxophone.
That's amazing.
A little later, the group became so popular that we were asked to perform on a TV show in Philadelphia called The Children's Hour.
Huh.
And we went and played, and they liked it so much that we were invited back on a regular basis once a month. It was a weekly show, but
Wow.
for quite a while we played once a month, and we'd pack up and go drive the 50 miles from Reading to Philadelphia and
Wow.
play on this show.
So when you were that young, you were already playing in a saxophone choir?
I was. And when I got to junior high school, I then switched teachers. I started studying with the junior high school band director. His name was J. Carl Borelli. He was a very well-known guy in Reading, Pennsylvania, and he was also a very good teacher. And he especially started to work on some things that I wasn't able to work on earlier, and I started to make a lot more improvement. When we left Reading, we moved to Philadelphia, and in Philadelphia, everyone said the best teacher around here is Michael Guerra. Michael Guerra was a former clarinetist with the Philadelphia Orchestra, and he also did the saxophone parts when they needed them with the Philadelphia Orchestra many, many, many years ago. And Michael Guerra was the first one who really started to introduce me to some classical music on saxophone. And it was standard works. The one that I worked mostly on was the Glasnow Concerto, and eventually I used that as my audition piece to go to Juilliard.
Oh.
But Michael Guerra would do all kinds of things that made an impact on me at the time and were long-lasting.
Sure.
He wasn't able to actually play himself because he had a heart condition. And the doctor had told him not to blow the instrument.
Wow.
But he would wrap his arms around me, and he was kind of a short guy, and it was a struggle to get his arms around me, but he would finger the saxophone while I blew it.
Oh.
And it showed me so many things. First of all, his technical ability was something that I had never, ever experienced. And but also just concentrating on blowing, and I sometimes didn't even know what he was going to be playing while he had his arms around. And it would surprise me because sometimes he would go up into the high register, and my high register all of a sudden started to sound better than it ever sounded because I didn't know it was coming.
Right.
Very interesting thing, and I eventually used it on occasion in my own teaching. It's a little bit difficult to use that these days.
Yeah, right.
For obvious
I
reasons.
understand, yeah.
After along the way, there were actually a number of other influences that I experienced. I'll go back when I was still around 8 years old. My mom and dad took me one time to a place called Sunnybrook, which was an old ballroom where the big bands used to play years before. And Gene Krupa was playing there.
Wow.
And the saxophonist with Gene Krupa was my mother's first cousin, named Eddie Shue, and
Wow.
my second cousin. Of
Yeah,
course.
Eddie Shue.
So
yeah.
I got to hear him play with Gene Krupa, and after the concert, they took me backstage, and I met Eddie Shue, and I met Gene Krupa. Gene Krupa gave me an autographed picture and a pair of his drumsticks,
No kidding.
which I still have.
Wow.
And but meeting Eddie Shue, who was my cousin,
Wow.
just made an impact, and I started taking things a lot more serious. After that, the next thing that made an impact on me, I think, was my parents took me to see the great jazz saxophonist Coleman Hawkins.
You saw Coleman Hawkins.
Yes,
In
this
person.
was at the Latin Casino in New Jersey, just across the bridge from Philadelphia.
Yeah.
And Coleman Hawkins, to me, still had one of the greatest sounds ever
Yes.
in jazz saxophone. And
Me too.
it was the influence on me was that sound is a critical part of playing the saxophone. And that stayed with me forever. I later saw Ray Charles,
Also in person.
in person at the Latin Casino.
Wow.
My parents took me to see that. And with his band, that made such an impact on me again that I was inspired, and I never ever will forget that performance. There have been many other groups and performances since then that have made an impact, but not like those.
Sure.
Although I was able to go to a concert when I was in New York. This is after I started going to Juilliard, and I heard Barbra Streisand
Wow.
at her famous Sheep Meadow concert in Central Park.
Sure.
And there were 100 and some thousand people at this concert, all seated on the grass. And when she came out to sing, it was like 100,000 people just clammed up. And if you could have heard a pin drop in the grass, you could have heard it. But she was one of the most amazing performers I'd ever seen. And again, that stuck with me. The musicality that she exhibited was stunning. After that, I had another experience. This was after I had already gone to California, but I'm getting a little ahead of things. But I wasn't here very long, and I went to hear Harvey Pittel play the Doll Concerto, and I think it was with the Los Angeles Philharmonic Orchestra.
Yeah.
And it was an afternoon concert.
Mm-hmm.
And that evening, I drove from Los Angeles out to Redlands, where Harvey Pittel
That's right.
played the Husa Concerto,
That's right.
all in one day.
That's right.
And I'll never forget that. It was one of the most amazing things I'd ever seen. 2 major concertos with 2 different groups, all in the same day.
That's very kind of you to remember that. I remember that I had to hire a private plane to fly to Redlands. Otherwise, I couldn't make it with the traffic. I remember that day. It's very kind of you. Forgot all about that.
I had one more major influence, and that was going to Las Vegas one time to see Sammy Davis Jr. live.
Wow.
And that show was the most amazing entertainment that I'd ever seen. More than entertainment, because he was a true artist, and he had the ability to do so many things at such an incredibly high level, and make it so that the audience was in the palm of his hand the whole time, whether he was singing, dancing, playing drums, telling stories or jokes or whatever he did. It was artistic and masterful.
Wow. I begin to understand now more and more how you're able to handle the wide range of style that you evince when you play or teach. I'm getting a picture of how that came about now with all of those many influences. It's amazing.
So getting back to Michael Guerra, he actually at one point called me and he said, "I just recommended you for a gig." And I was 17 years old at the time. I had just finished my junior year in high school.
Yeah.
And
gee, that's pretty young.
I got a call from a guy, and he said he was from a group called the Intruders. Wow. And I knew who the Intruders were because they were a very popular group at the time and had a hit record. And he said, "Our saxophone player is ill, and I need somebody for the next couple of weeks. Could you play? We have 1 week in Ohio, and then another week in New Jersey." So,
wow, 17 years old.
So, a couple of days later, he picked me up at my house, and we were on the Pennsylvania Turnpike heading out to Ohio. I think it was either Akron or Toledo. I don't remember now, but and played a week there at a nightclub, and got back. And then the next week was at a nightclub in New Jersey, not far from Philadelphia. So we were playing out there, and my parents said, "Well, we'd like to come hear you play." And playing with the group, the Intruders, that week was a singer. I can't remember her name anymore, but she was kind of a Pearl Bailey type singer. Very, very soulful, really a great singer and entertainer.
Yeah.
And so my parents came out, and when the singer heard my parents were in the audience, she said, in front of the whole audience, "Okay, we're going to feature the saxophone player." And all of a sudden she said, "Blues in B flat."
Oh.
So I started to play. She said, "You start it." And she started singing along. And before I knew it, she's kind of all over me, kissing me on the cheeks and on the forehead. And here I was trying to concentrate on the blues. Anyway, afterward, I was a little embarrassed about the whole thing, and I went down. I was sitting with my parents, and my parents were kind of laughing. She came over to the table and introduced herself to my parents, and she said, "I hope you don't mind. We were just having a little fun." and anyway, I went to the restroom after that, and I realized why everyone was laughing so hard, because my face was covered with these big red lip marks.
That's a great story. That's amazing. You had all these amazing influences, and at young ages. Wow. So Roger, I know that you attended Juilliard and lived in New York. And I know you studied with Joe Allard, who I also studied with. I wonder if you could give us an idea of your years living in New York and attending Juilliard, and talk about your studies with Joe Allard.
As I mentioned before, I used the Glazunov Concerto to audition for Juilliard, and I was thrilled that I was accepted and I was going to New York.
Gee.
And I was fortunate that I had a roommate who was one of my high school friends, who was a bass player.
Oh.
And wound up rooming with him and another fellow who we met at Juilliard. There were three of us living in an apartment, and living in New York was just a great thing.
Yeah.
But I went in for my first lesson with Joe Allard, and I literally played one note. And Joe Allard said, "Okay, put the horn down and let's talk for a little bit." Mm-hmm. Well, he talked for the rest of the lesson. Mm-hmm. I walked out, and I was kind of in I don't know what I would call it. I was just so amazed. There was one of my new classmates standing out in the hall, and he said, "How was your lesson?" Because he was kind of nervous about going in. And I said, "I only played one note, but it was the most amazing lesson I'd ever had in my life."
Yep.
And Joe Allard talked about sound, and that's why everybody called him the tone doctor. Mm. And he got that nickname actually from guys who had come off the road with a lot of the big bands, developing bad playing habits, and Joe would be able to kind of fix everything so quickly.
Sure.
So they called him the tone doctor. And that was my introduction to Joe Allard, and I had the great privilege of studying with him for over a period of 6 years. Mm. I had, after my first, well, during my first year at Juilliard, I was also working, and I had a job with a group of guys from Philadelphia, and this group became the house band for a rock and roll TV show.
Wow.
in CBS TV in Philadelphia.
Gee.
It was called The Discophonic Scene with Jerry Blavat.
All right.
He was a very famous guy in Philadelphia, had his own radio show. But we played for many of the big rock groups each week on this show. I'd commute back and forth from New York to do this while I was going to school at Juilliard.
Amazing.
After the first year, then I started playing more gigs around. After my second year at Juilliard, I got a job up in the Catskill Mountains. Uh-huh. And I was playing at a resort hotel there in the show band. And it was a time when the Vietnam War was going on, and all of a sudden, even though I had only completed 2 years at Juilliard, I got a draft notice and started asking around, and people said, "You might want to try for the West Point Band." Hmm. And I went up and took an audition for the West Point Band and was accepted. And so it meant enlisting for 3 years rather than being drafted for 2.
Yeah.
But it meant that I would be playing in the West Point Band.
Sure.
So this was August of 1966, and I wound up enlisting, and after basic training, I went to West Point and played in the band, which is where we met.
Yes, indeed. Where was your basic?
Basic training was in Fort Campbell, Kentucky.
Okay.
on the Kentucky-Tennessee line. Half of it was in Tennessee, half in Kentucky.
I see.
it was an experience that
Yeah.
wouldn't care to repeat.
So when you got to the band, was I already there, or did I come after you?
I think a little after.
So I got there a little after you.
Yeah.
I see. Yeah.
So, in any case, in the West Point band, it turned out to be a truly amazing experience in that I met so many great musicians, yourself. And that's where we formed the West Point Saxophone Quartet
Yes, indeed.
with Marshall Taylor and Emmett Yoshioka.
Yep.
And we were able to play concerts all over the place. We played in all over the Northeast, and we did trips to the Midwest, West Coast, even to Hawaii.
That's right.
And it really, for me, it was a time when I was exposed to more classical music than I'd ever been exposed to before. And kind of changed my direction. And after West Point, I went back to New York. I was still playing a lot of jazz at that time, and I had one more year to finish at Juilliard. And right after I started, I got a call to play with the Tommy Dorsey Band.
Wow.
And Juilliard was kind enough to give me a leave of absence for a month to go on tour with the Tommy Dorsey Band.
Tremendous.
And it was a great experience. Came back and continued at Juilliard. Right after that, I got the job then as lead alto player in the Grossinger's Resort Hotel show band.
Wow.
And that was, Grossinger's was one of the historic big hotels in the Catskill Mountains. And we were playing for a lot of the great entertainers of the time.
Gee.
And that was on weekends, so I was able to do it while I was going to school. And holiday periods, we did 6 nights.
That's amazing.
And that went on for about a year.
My. And what chair did you play in that? Were you a tenor player in that?
No, in that band, I was the lead alto player.
No kidding.
In Tommy Dorsey Band,
Yeah.
I played the lead tenor.
Lead tenor. I see. And could you just speak to the point of how you changed your own ideas of what kind of career you were going to have? You mentioned the West Point Band that that was maybe the most classical music you had did. So how did you see your career before the band, and how did you see your career after that? How did it change?
I wanted, at that time, I wanted really to be a studio musician in New York.
Ah, I see.
And I was starting to work on my doubles at the time, and I had played clarinet before. Not much flute, but a little bit.
Yeah.
But as I started to get into all the classical music, playing with the West Point Saxophone Quartet, with you and the other guys in the quartet, I just started to change my ideas about things, and the whole classical part became much more important to me. So we went on, and when I left New York, I decided, I had been talking with you, actually, and we talked about my coming out to Los Angeles.
Right.
And I eventually did that, and we formed the Los Angeles Saxophone Quartet.
That's right. We did. Yeah.
That later evolved into the Harvey Pittel Saxophone Quartet.
Right. Yeah. Huh. That's fantastic. So when you got to Los Angeles, I know you did a lot of teaching and playing. Could you talk about those? So you were in LA for what, 10 years?
10 years,
Yeah.
yes.
Could you talk about those years and your activities?
Well, when I got there, the first job I got, thanks to you, was teaching at the USC preparatory school.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And in addition to that, shortly after that, I was teaching at Caltech as their woodwind coach for their extracurricular musical activities, which they did not have a music major there.
Right.
I also started teaching at Long Beach State at that time. Later on, at one time or another, I taught at San Diego State, and later Cal State Fullerton, which is where I did most of my teaching. And I did that for about 5 or 6 years until I applied for a full-time position at the University of Northern Colorado, and that's when I wound up moving to Colorado.
I see.
And spent 24 years
Wow.
teaching.
So while you were in LA, before we go on, you also did some playing. You made some movies, etc. What was that all about?
I was fortunate enough to be able to get some studio calls. I played for a couple of the really great movie composers, John Williams and Jerry Goldsmith. Also got to play one movie score with Lalo Schifrin.
How about that?
And in addition to some of those things, I played a TV series called The Swiss Family Robinson.
Sure, I remember it.
And along the way, I was able to do some things as an on-call saxophonist with the Los Angeles Philharmonic.
Right.
And various other things. But I was still looking for a little more stability. And that's when I decided it was time to apply for a full-time position.
So when you moved to teach to Greeley to teach at Northern Colorado, University of Northern Colorado, what year would that have been?
1980.
So that's also about the time we started touring with Harvey Pittel Saxophone Quartet.
Yes.
Yeah. Right. Wow. So you taught at University of Northern Colorado for 24 years. Is that what you said? Yeah. So during that time, can you tell us about those years? Tell us about the book you wrote as well.
The years at UNC was a great time for me. When you're in a full-time position at a university, it's so much different than teaching part-time at a number of different universities.
Yes, it is.
This is a place where you can put all of your energies into one school and one group of students. And
Yes.
In addition to the teaching, I was also playing all around the Colorado area. I was for the 24 years that I taught at UNC, I was the on-call saxophonist with the Colorado Symphony. And I played in other orchestras around, up in Aspen during the summertime with other orchestras. There were a lot of things happening in the Colorado mountains during the summertime, a lot of musical things. And it worked out very well for me.
It's great. So I happen to know about your book that you wrote about music. I'm very impressed with it. Could you tell us how it came about, what were your inspirations to write it, and maybe just tell us a little about the book itself?
Yes, the book is about musicianship, and it talks about so many things that I learned over the years from many people. And it started really with scraps of paper where I had written notes when I was taking lessons with Joe Allard. I would come out of a lesson and I'd write down what we talked about. So I had, I don't know how many, just a stack of these little notes. And I just kept them all those years, and I finally decided I need to do something about this, and I applied for a teaching assistant at the time, and I got a teaching assistant for the purpose of putting all these notes together into a book.
Wow.
And so we had designated times, a couple of times a week, where we would meet, and my teaching assistant helped me organize all these things, and I started elaborating on everything, and pretty soon came up with various chapters for the book.
That's fantastic. It's a wonderful book. What is the title of the book?
Musicianship for Wind Players.
And how does one obtain this book?
It's published by Dorn Publications.
Good. It's a wonderful book. You gave me a copy a long time ago, and I've learned a lot from it. Well, Roger, I happen to know that after all these wonderful accomplishments in the past number of years, you've also made major improvements in saxophone technology in the industry. Would you tell us how this came about, and how you gained the knowledge to accomplish all of this technical stuff about the saxophone?
This is kind of an interesting story. I was still teaching at UNC at the time, and I got a call, actually an email, from a fellow from Taiwan, and he said, I learned about you on the internet, and I would like to come and take some lessons. And it was just before summertime, so I had more free time in the summer. I said, sure, I'm available. Mm-hmm. And I thought, well, I'll probably never hear again about this. But shortly thereafter, all of a sudden, he showed up in Greeley, Colorado, and he walked in for his first lesson, and he took out a saxophone, and I said, what is that saxophone? He said, well, my company made this. And I tried it and was not impressed. Mm-hmm. And I was nice about it, I thought, but honest.
Sure.
And he didn't take it in the wrong way. He just said, well, what do I need to do to make it better? And I started talking about things. He was a really nice guy, and he wound up staying for about a month, taking 3 lessons a week.
Really?
And he finally went back to Taiwan, and like a week later, I get an email, and he invited me to come over to Taiwan to play a concert.
Really? Huh.
And it was sponsored by the Rotary Club of Taipei.
I see.
And I went over, and I played the concert, and it was very successful. And he took me for a tour of an area. Well, there's a big city called Taichung in south of Taipei, about 2 hours. And there's a small city or village or town just outside of Taichung called Hali, which is famous for saxophones.
Really?
And there are quite a number of saxophone factories there, and saxophone-related companies. Like, for example, there's a company that specializes just in lacquering.
Really? Huh.
There's a company that specializes in making screws,
Wow.
keys. All of a sudden, I looked around as something I had never, ever thought about or seen before. And I was introduced to the manager of one of the factories. And he asked me again, what would you look for in a saxophone?
Sure.
I was able to speak not from a point of view of a technician or an acoustician or anything like that, but from the point of view of a performer. Mm-hmm. So I told him regarding sound what I would look for and how an instrument feels to blow, the resistance, the degree of free blowing, things like that. Intonation I talked about, key work, and I left Taiwan, went home. About a year after that, I was not on my way, but I was I was preparing to go to Bangkok to play another concert and do a workshop in Bangkok. And I said, I have a stopover in Taiwan. So I called this fellow and told him I had a stopover on the way to Bangkok.
Yeah.
And I said, I'm not sure how long I have, but he said, meet me in the terminal between your flights. And sure, I got to Taiwan and I got off the plane, and all of a sudden I walked up to the gate agent and I said, I have a friend who's meeting me in the terminal right now, but I have to catch my flight to Bangkok. And he said, you're not going to have enough time. I said, but he's waiting for me. I have to see him. All of a sudden, this fellow said, follow me. And I was running through the terminal in Taipei, trying to keep up with this guy. And it was during the SARS crisis.
Yeah.
So I had to go through a health check. But he took me to the front of the line, and they gave me a form. And he said, just sign it. And I signed it, and I'm running to the next step, and it was for the immigration. They checked my passport. But again, he took me to the front of the line, and I got through there, and then I had to go through customs thing. I finally got to the terminal. This fellow's standing there, and I walked up and I shook his hand. He handed me a saxophone, turned around, and ran the other way, having to go through all the things again to get back. And I literally ran onto the airplane right before they closed the door.
Oh, my gosh.
I got to Bangkok. I got into my hotel, opened up the saxophone, and I tried it. And I was surprised because it was a very good horn.
Wow, just like that.
And I wound up using it on the concert that I played in Bangkok.
Was this an alto now?
It was an alto at the time, yes.
Wow.
And this fellow came down from Taipei to Bangkok to hear my concert, and he was thrilled that I was playing it. And he kept asking me to get more involved after that. And that's kind of how I got involved in the saxophone design and development. And I started going to Taiwan more often and talking to the designers at the factory and talking about different kinds of things. I was learning so much at the time, learning about different types of brass, different types of necks, key work, everything you can think of that has anything to do with saxophone manufacturing. And pretty soon we were able to come out with the P. Moriarty saxophones, and I retired from UNC at the time, and I got involved with those saxophones and introduced them in America.
To North America, yeah.
And they became very popular very quickly.
You did a wonderful job, I might add.
So after about 6 years, for a variety of reasons, I moved on, and I actually got a call from Bob Seberg, who heard...
Oh, yeah, the late Bob Seberg.
Bob Seberg heard that I had left P. Moriarty, and he said, would you be interested in getting involved with Eastman? And I said yes. And I was still living in Colorado at the time. I flew out to Los Angeles and met with Chen, the owner of Eastman, and Saul Friedgood, the president of Eastman. And before I knew it, I was working for Eastman.
And here we are at Andreas Eastman right now.
And the saxophones have come a long way
Thanks
for
to you.
Eastman. And one of the most interesting things that happened along the way was we're looking to make some improvements way back, and when I first came on. And we were talking to Bob Mintzer at one point. And Bob Mintzer, of course, has come on as an endorser.
Right.
But we were looking for a new neck. And Bob had a vintage saxophone. And we wanted to see what we could do to come up with something that would be at least similar to the sounds that you were getting out of a vintage saxophone, and a lot of it had to do with the neck design. So we borrowed Bob Mintzer's neck, and we hand-carried it to Taiwan, and we kind of analyzed things about it and tried all kinds of different things, and that's how we eventually came up with the Eastman neck.
Wow.
It's been going great ever since.
Well, you've done amazing things over the years that you've been involved in improving saxophones in the industry. You've said, "Hey, Harv, why don't you try this horn?" I can remember 2 times when I tried a horn and didn't particularly like it, and then you came back a little while later and say, "Well, we've made these improvements. Now try it again," and it would be tremendous. That happened 2 different times. You've done amazing work. How have you dealt with the language barrier as you work in Taiwan or parts of China, mainland China?
It's something that can be a big problem, especially when you're talking about technical things with technical language. Sometimes I found out early on I would complain about something, and first of all, it's a problem where you have to complain nicely.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you don't get anything accomplished. But what I would complain about sometimes was misinterpreted. So I would come back the next time, and maybe I would be so frustrated because I realized that they didn't do at all what I thought they would be doing.
Sure.
But learning that early on helped me, because then it got to where I could start taking pictures of things, and I would get the horn out and show them in person. Trying to do it by email sometimes was not helping.
Right.
And so it was a learning process for me, and it still can be frustrating at times.
Yeah. Well, I'm getting a little bit of a picture of what I call the Roger Greenberg magic. I remember in the Harvey Pittel Saxophone Quartet, we at one point were breaking in a new baritone saxophonist, and it wasn't quite happening. And you said something about, well, I'll talk to him. And you did. You talked to them. I never knew, and still don't know, what you said or what you taught him. But the next night, he was phenomenal. The quartet was phenomenal. So I call that the Roger Greenberg magic. And so you do evince that magic when you play and have all these years. In the saxophone quartet, when you play tenor saxophone in a saxophone quartet or any other ensemble, maybe any saxophone, but I've experienced you as a classical tenor saxophone player par excellence, the best in the world.
Thank you.
It is, yeah. It is the Roger Greenberg magic. The quartet all of a sudden it's there. So I'm getting a picture of the rest of that magic as you develop these instruments called hard work and smarts. So it's been my pleasure to have this conversation with you here at Andreas Eastman. Thank you, Roger.
Thank you, Harvey.